after school.
But that should continue. We've got science on our side. We've got morality on our side. We've got science on our side. We've got morality on our side. We've got science on our side. We've got morality on our side.
You've been chosen.
We got science on our side. We got morality on our side. You see where he is. I ask you to take these clips into context. You will see a disturbing picture emerge.
What do you say to Dr. Fauci tonight?
Well, I would remind him that anytime healthcare intersects with dollars, it gets awkward. Right now, Medicare has determined that if you have a COVID-19 admission to the hospital, you'll get paid $13,000. If that COVID-19 patient goes on a ventilator, you get $39,000.
Claim, if the patient goes on a ventilator, you get $39,000. Article on Rev Cycle Intelligence. Hospital reimbursement for uninsured cases may total $42 billion. Author, Jacqueline Lapointe. That reimbursement range is based on Medicare reimbursement for hospital admissions for similar conditions, including respiratory infections and inflammations with major comorbidities or complications, which average $13,297 in reimbursements, and in more severe cases, respiratory system diagnoses with ventilator support for greater than 96 hours, which average $40,218. Ventilation for somebody with a pneumonia typically will last at least 3 days and sometimes over 3 days because of the difficulty with vent weaning for weak lungs. Dr. Jensen's basic contention is indeed correct that hospitals will be reimbursed at least 3 times the rate for patients who require ventilation. So would this incentivize unscrupulous facilities to want to intubate patients that might not yet need it? This is my search query. Here's the first article. I'll read this. Even as hospitals and governors raise the alarm about the shortage of ventilators, some critical care physicians are questioning the widespread use of the breathing machines for these patients, saying large numbers of patients could instead be treated with less intensive respiratory support. If these iconoclasts are right, putting these patients on ventilators could be of little benefit to many and even harmful to some. What's driving this reassessment is the baffling observation about these patients. Many of them have blood oxygen levels so low that they should be dead, but they're not gasping for air, their hearts aren't racing, and their brains show no signs of blinking off from lack of oxygen. This is making critical care physicians suspect that blood levels of oxygen, which for decades have driven decisions about breathing support for patients with pneumonia and acute respiratory distress, might be misleading them about how to care for these patients. In particular, more and more are concerned about the use of intubation and mechanical ventilators. They argue that more patients could receive simpler, non-invasive respiratory support, such as the breathing mask used in sleep apnea, at least to start with and maybe for the duration of the illness. An excerpt from this report. Reports in China, Italy, and US have found that less than half of the patients who are intubated recover. Experts are unsure why the death rates are so high.
Is Dr. Cameron Kyle Seidel. He's a physician trained in emergency medicine and critical care, and he practices at Maimonides in Brooklyn, New York. Welcome, Dr. Seidel.
Thank you very much. Thank you for inviting me.
So you've been talking a lot about the number of patients, the percentage of patients actually, that are dying on ventilators. When did you first notice this trend?
So in preparation of opening what was, going to be what became a full COVID positive intensive care units, we kind of scoured the data just to see what was out there. And obviously, those that have experienced it before us, primarily the Chinese and the Italians, it was hard to find exactly, what the rate of, what we call successful extubation, meaning someone was put on a ventilator and taken off. And that data is still hard to find. And I imagine there's a lot of people still on ventilators. But from the data we have available, it appears to be, somewhere between 50 and 90%. And it seems that most reports or most published data, puts it around 70%. So, that's a very, very high percentage in general when one thinks of a medical disease.
And you've been talking on social media. You say you see things that you've never seen before. What are some of those things that you're seeing?
So when I initially started treating patients, I was under the impression, as most people were, that I was going to be treating acute respiratory distress syndrome that was similar in some sense to the, ARDS that I saw as a fellow. Um, and as I started to treat these patients, I witnessed things that are just unusual. And I'm sure doctors around the country are experiencing this. It's not, in the past, we don't see patients that are talking in full sentences and not complaining of overt shortness of breath with saturations in the high 70s. It's just not something we typically see. When we're intubating some of these patients, that is to say, when we're putting a breathing tube in, they tend to drop their saturations very quickly. And we see saturations going down to 20 to 30. And typically, one would expect some kind of reflexive response from the heart rate. Which is to say, usually we see tachycardia, and if patients go too low, then we see bradycardia. And these are things that, we just weren't seeing. I've seen literally a saturation of 0 on a monitor, which is not something we ever want and something we actually actively try to avoid. And yet, we saw it, and many of my colleagues have similarly have seen, saturations of 10 and 20. And our whole practice is aimed, when we try to put breathing tubes in, is to avoid this very situation. Now, these patients tend to desaturate extremely quickly, and so these situations have occurred. And still, what we're seeing, that there was no change in the heart rate, is just unusual. It's just something that we are not used to. So that's
Suggesting that this is more like a high a viral pneumonia that we're talking.
yeah. So what I was trying to find, the patients in front of me are unlike any patients I've ever seen. And I've seen, a great many number of patients, and I've treated many diseases, and you get used to seeing certain patterns, and just the patterns I was seeing did not make sense. Now this, originally came to be when we had a patient who had hit what we called our trigger to put in a breathing tube, meaning she had displayed a level of hypoxemia, of low oxygen levels, where we thought she would need a breathing tube. And most of the times when patients hit that level of hypoxemia, they are in distress and they can barely talk and they can't say complete sentences. And she could do all of those, and she did not want a breathing tube. And so she asked that we put it in at the last minute possible. And it was this perplexing clinical condition. When I was supposed to put the breathing tube in, when was the last minute possible? And all the instincts as a physician, we're looking to see if she, so-called tires out, if she's getting too tired. None of those things occurred.
So basically, Dr. Cameron Siddell discovered that his patients were having symptoms more like altitude sickness. So therefore, they shouldn't be on the ARDS protocol at his hospital. So what happened? How did he respond? Well, the admission you're about to see is absolutely remarkable. I will preface his admission with these statistics. Search query. Article. New York Governor Andrew Cuomo recently estimated that only 20% of coronavirus patients placed on ventilators will ever come off. Here, President Trump implies what he knows about ventilator outcomes.
Reasons that I keep talking about hydroxychloroquine is that the question that nobody ever asks, and the question that I most hate the answer to, is what happens if you do have a ventilator? What are your chances? And I just hope that hydroxychloroquine wins, coupled with perhaps the Z-Pack, as we call it, dependent totally on your doctors and the doctors there. Because you know the answer to that question. If you do have the ventilator, you know the answer to that question. And I hate giving the answer. So I don't want to get them there. I don't want to get them there. There's a possibility, and I say it. What do you have to lose? I'll say it again. What do you have to lose? Take it. I really think they should take it. But it's their choice, and it's their doctor's choice or the doctors in the hospital. But hydroxychloroquine, try it.
The spooky sounding soothing of his voice notwithstanding, the implication is clear. The ventilators are killing the people. Now, all that said, let's look what happened to Dr. Cameron Siddell when he decided to treat patients the way he really wants to treat them and not as per protocol.
In our hospital, I mean, we generally,
You talked about in your videos,
yeah.
against long-standing dogma. So what's been the response from your clinical colleagues as well as hospital administrators?
So to be honest, in the ICU, I started to try to, run not my own protocols, but to treat patients as I would have treated my family under, with the different goals, which is to say a ventilation. However, these didn't fit the protocol, and the protocol is what the hospital runs on, with the respiratory therapists, what the nurses. I mean, everyone is part of the team. And so actually we ran into an impasse where I could not morally in a patient doctor relationship, I could not continue the current protocols, which again are the protocols of the top hospitals in the country. But I could not continue those. And obviously they couldn't have someone, you can't have one doctor just doing their own protocol. So I actually had to step down from my position in the ICU. And so now I'm back in the ER, where we are setting up slightly different ventilation strategies, but fortunately we've been boosted by recent work by Gattinoni, which actually was formally published today, which does outline not the best evidence-based and at least expert recommendations for changes in what were our overall protocols.
So Dr. Cameron Siddell, he put his best foot forward and ultimately was kicked out of the ICU. So putting everything together, we have a suspected 80% mortality for people who wind up requiring the ventilation. We have an incentive for Medicare reimbursement to put people on ventilation. We have essentially whistleblowing ER critical care doctor who decided to alter the protocol for treating these patients only to be removed from his position. He still works at the hospital, but just in the ED now, that is emergency department. We have nearly incessant media bickering concerning the number of ventilators going to various states. We have widespread media disparagement of potentially beneficial treatments, including hydroxychloroquine, zinc, and azithromycin. Can you see the picture that begins to form when all these facts are laid out before you? And then to that picture, add the clip from the previous video on the similar topic that I showed you, where it was demonstrated that presumptive cases of individuals with these COVID-like symptoms are also considered to be positive for that disease. You can test positive and then die from a heart attack, but still have the death considered the condition instead of the heart attack. And as has also been shown, there are even cases where people are showing symptoms, they're given the diagnosis without the test being done. So if you can't see it, I'll explain it to you. We have a condition where what I'll describe as the sociopathic establishment is harnessing the worst natural inclinations of human nature in order to trump up the case total for the disease as well as to trump up the death total for the disease, both artificially for the purpose of increasing reimbursement, and then in clinical practice by widespread mismanagement of the patients and suppression of any dissenting voices. How insane is that? This viral pandemic I would describe as a test model that shows why our potential to advance in civilization is so hindered. This pattern of plainly nihilistic behavior has been demonstrated through all levels of society and through most, if not all, countries in the world. Throughout all levels of society, There are good players and there are bad players. It appears the bad players have more decisive influence at each of these levels. Collectively, there is the appearance of good being done most of the time, but beneath that veneer is a rot. We are called to aggregate this information, to disseminate it, and to determine what is the next best action to take. The first step to any sane action is getting to the point where the civilization recognizes that there is indeed a problem.